Thank you so much for joining us today on Connect and Collaborate, where we come together each day to introduce you to our network of business and community leaders and to discuss important issues that impact business in Colorado and the region. I'm Tammy Schaefer, your on-air producer, and today we are connecting with, let me read it, the American Council of Engineering Companies of Colorado, known as ACEC. And we are going to be talking about why we care about transportation and kind of the engineering perspective in that. So I think we're going to learn a lot about what's behind a lot of things we take for granted. First off, I want to introduce Elizabeth Stolfus with Stolfus and Associates. Elizabeth, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
And I have Bill Barreire. He's the Vice President and Operations Manager for Vivid Engineering Group. Bill.
Glad to be here.
Thank you for joining us. And Brad Doyle, Project Director for Atkins and also a member of the SNC Lavalin Group.
Thank you for having us here today.
Thank you so much, Brad. So again, glad to have all of you here, and then we're going to have even more engineers in our second segment, so you'll want to stick around. And I guess, Bill, we want to start out, kind of provide us some information of why should we care about transportation? I think we all do. We're all in our vehicles and encountering whatever problems or benefits or advantages are on the roadways, right?
Sure, absolutely. I guess to kick it off, if you think about it, transportation and the mobility that it provides is really the backbone of a lot of everyday activity in the United States, and Colorado is no different. From a work standpoint, a lot of people commute to work. There's work-related travel to meetings and job sites and radio shows, things like that. From a play standpoint, we have people who like to ski, hike, fish, go up into the mountains, kids sporting events during the summer. From a commerce standpoint, a lot of transportation or transporting and shipping of goods. If you think about the mail alone, just think about the mail, right. FedEx, UPS. If you buy things on Amazon, how much of that stuff is out there on the transportation network, all the time, 24/7.
If the rest of us just sat at home, wouldn't they?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, and then from a emergency and military standpoint, there's an importance there too. You got the police, fire, ambulance, and so they need good mobility so they can react quickly to emergencies.
Right.
Bottom line is that almost everybody relies on transportation on a daily basis. So I guess the next point is, how does transportation and transportation projects benefit the public? I have three kind of main points there. One would be safety, two would be quality of life, and three would be economic benefits. And from a safety standpoint, a good transportation system will help to minimize injuries and deaths, those things that nobody wants to run into on the roadway. And it also minimizes the economic impact to those individuals, whether it's bodily injury or, vehicular problems with their cars.
Right.
And then the incidences on the highway system, if people get a wreck, it's like takes one little wreck and then it's the ripple effect through the whole system, and it seems to just block everything up.
It absolutely does. Yeah. It's amazing how one, and sometimes it's not even an accident, because usually when you get past the bottleneck, there's nothing there.
Right. Right. So
they've moved on, or
yeah, absolutely.
There's still an impact.
Yeah, it's like what happened. You typically never know what happened, right?
Exactly.
Because it has such a huge ripple effect. So safety is a huge factor in why we should care about our transportation. Quality of life, an efficient transportation system provides just a more efficient, easier way to travel. It's a little easier mentally. I know if you commute between Colorado Springs and Denver, or Fort Collins and Denver, a lot of times you run into that aggravating backup, things like that. So commute time is a huge impact for people who go a long ways to work. There's a lot of people that work in Denver or maybe in Colorado Springs, maybe in Fort Collins, and that back and forth commute just takes away from family time or productive time,
Absolutely.
Things like that.
Yeah.
So there's that impact. From an economic standpoint, kind of more locally to Colorado, there's an efficiency of commute and mobility. So when your commute is easier, there's a lot more folks that are able and willing to commute to a job. So it impacts the the economy that way. More people will drive further, commute further to a job if they can get there with relative ease.
Exactly.
So we got to make sure that that happens. And then if you think about skiing and mountain tourism, if you've ever been on I-70 West going skiing, get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to beat the traffic. Sometimes you still sit in a couple hours worth of traffic. So it impacts, the tourism industry quite a bit. And those are just a couple examples. And then there's the interstate connection to other states.
Of course.
Right. So there's goods coming in and out of Colorado, and that also brings the good infrastructure will bring large companies that have big economic impact, bring jobs to the state, and then last but not least, a lot of the transportation projects themselves provide a lot of jobs for a lot of people.
Absolutely.
Some of these larger projects will have thousands of people put to work for durations of 2 to 5 years.
Yeah.
So.
Speaking of those jobs, let's talk about the work. Why does the engineering of all these projects matter? I know all the engineers are devoted to creating what we need to get around. Right.
So I guess in short, engineers make sure that the goal of the project is met. So engineers, and I would put engineering and planning kind of together. A lot of the same teams work together at the beginning of the project and throughout the project to make sure that the project goals are met. I mean, before a project even happens, there's a reason why you're doing it, whether it's congestion or safety or some other issue. So the engineers and the planners work through that detail and the issues to make sure that the project works as intended. And then they also prepare before it goes to construction. Somebody's got to prepare plans and specifications for a contractor to build it. So the engineers and planners put all that together in a package so they can get the contractor to build it correctly.
Right.
Yep.
Well, thank you for all that explanation, and I know it really does matter. I think this is a lot of work that a lot of us take for granted as we're out there driving and maybe even complaining a little bit about what we encounter on the roadways. So Elizabeth and Brad, I want to invite you to jump in. Tell us, if we talk about the current state of transportation in Colorado, I know a lot of people are frustrated, and we know the CDOT is working on doing kind of an overhaul of I-70. We're working on I-25 North and I-25 South. All of this coming up. It's going to be a lot of work, and I'm sure they're scheduling it to avoid as many delays as possible. But what can you tell us about the current state of transportation system here?
I think one of the things that's very interesting about the state of transportation in Colorado is that in many ways we have a very mature system in that we've built a lot of resources that support our everyday transportation. But that doesn't mean that those parts of the system don't still need investment. They still need caring for, just like we have to care for our own homes and our children.
When you say mature system, do we mean old?
Well, I guess I wasn't thinking old, but you could say old. I guess I was thinking there are a lot of parts that are built, right? There are a lot of the things that we need that already exist.
Yeah, the infrastructure is there.
The infrastructure is really there. There is still a need for expansion, though.
Absolutely.
We find our population is growing. We're having new businesses and new residents in Colorado. We're having new opportunities to invest in lots of new parts of our economy, and those portions also need transportation investment. So while we need to take care of what we've already got, we also need to expand into those areas that don't have what they yet need, and that's a really big effort. It's unfortunately just like the things in our own personal lives. We have to plan for those things, invest in them, and sort of nurture them along to their ultimate destination. And I think that's one of the big opportunities we have in Colorado right now. I don't know what you think, Brad. But.
Well, yeah, I mean, all very important stuff, but there's a big part of this investment that is going undone because of the limited resources that the state has. There's only so much money and so much time that you can put into things. We're seeing pavement surfaces that are deteriorating. We have to prioritize projects. What is the most impact and where can the money be put for the most use. So there's a lot of that going on, both just in the big maintenance jobs, the overlays and the bridge rehabs and stuff there. maintenance itself, just the everyday maintenance in that. There's a lot of stuff that goes undone there because of the limitations. Like Elizabeth was saying, we're seeing a congestion on the roadways increasing as more people come in, more people are driving, more miles are being driven. That means more cars on the road.
And our world is changing fast. I think we're all experiencing all throughout our lives that there's a really fast pace of change that's happening right now. And many of our transportation systems weren't designed for that pace of change. So in looking at how we can best serve our communities and what we really need and value as a community, I think we have some really hard questions to tackle in figuring just what should we do next and what's most important, because there are a lot of changes happening in our systems, and they're not lasting longer. They're getting worn just as quickly as they ever were.
Right. And it sounds like, I have you all here from different engineering firms, different companies. So it sounds like you all work together to some degree to plan everything, because there has to be different groups working on different areas, different portions of our transportation system. How do you all kind of work together?
Yeah. So, on a typical project, you're right. We have environmental planning and a slew of engineers that do different things. So on your typical project, and you could add in here too, but you have traffic engineers who look at the current traffic issue and how to fix it, right? So that's their job. You have civil engineers, and that's kind of a blanket thing for all of us, but real civil engineers prepare survey. They work through the roadway geometry, the changes in the roadway that need to occur. They work on existing utility conflicts, and relocations, things that need to happen. Work on existing drainage features that might need to be modified or changed, if the roadway geometry changes.
Our firms will end up hiring each other to work, and we'll work together. I've done a lot of projects with Elizabeth. We've worked with Bill and his company in that. I think we've probably flipped it around, and Elizabeth, we've helped you out on some things. So yes, we do a lot of work together in all of the engineering disciplines. We
actually happen to be in transportation in a kind of lucky place. We all get to be creative within our areas of expertise, and at the same time, we get to have I don't know if it's unique to our world, but it sometimes feels like it is, the ability to trust in the expertise of our partners. So when Brad takes on a part of the design that's not my expertise, I know he knows what he needs to do, and I know what we both need to be good at is where our parts interface so that we have a smooth and complete design all around. And I find that, in terms of how much ego is in the room, our world seems to have a pretty well-managed level, and not that people don't every now and then get very passionate, but in general, we have quite a lot of appreciation and respect for each other as we're doing our work.
It's fantastic, because I had never really considered how all these different firms must work together to accomplish what we're driving on out there. So thanks for doing that.
Yeah, we all have our areas of expertise, and we know where to fill in.
Yep.
So did we want to talk a little bit about the funding system for transportation? What comes next?
Yeah. So, on the funding side, if we look at it at the state level, funding is primarily two major sources, which is the federal fuel tax and the state motor fuel tax. The interesting thing about both of those is at the state level, that tax was last raised in 1992. So we're going on 26 years of that tax being in place. And that tax is on gasoline at 22 cents per gallon. And that's important because it's a per gallon tax.
Right.
And it has been stagnant for a long time. You look at the revenue that's been generated after that as vehicles get more fuel efficient.
I was going to say, we have much more fuel efficient vehicles, so the gallons
is going down, even though the miles is going up, gallons is going down. And yes, the
funding taxed it per mile, where would we be?
Well,
that's out there. There are people that are actually looking at a per mile tax. And states
we'd have constant construction just like Nebraska if that were the case. Or Utah.
It's interesting to see that our current tax structure, it is a flat at best.
Right.
Tax. There's other sources. There's vehicle registration fees
Right.
that add into it. Locals have also do a lot of taxes for themselves for their roadway networks. Sales and property tax type of things.
I was going to say, like the city of Colorado Springs has the PPRTA, which is it's a 1% sales tax, and that's basically for capital projects where they're going to reconstruct an intersection, something like that. Then they also approved 2C, which is more on the maintenance end of things. So that's filling in potholes, overlaying the existing roads, which is really important to try and get the longevity out of your existing system. So they have that. Canyon City followed suit with referendum 2A. So they're reconstructing roads under that. And then Pueblo as well, I think, has a 2C. I think it's also a 2C. So they're kicking off the same thing. So it seems like a lot of the local agencies and the voters are approving these things to kind of improve the system. It's working well.
The funny thing is, I actually calculated what my tax burden is in my pickup that I do, and my fuel tax burden in that.
Sure.
And I think it's approximately about $330 that I pay in fuel tax in a year's time, and this is between the state and the federal, about $330. And you think about, if you were to think about the roadway as a utility, and I'm paying $330 a year for my utility, that's a pretty cheap utility bill.
No kidding.
I mean,
And Brad drives.
A lot.
I drive a lot.
So we talked about the state gas tax, where we have that basis, and some of the changes that are coming to maybe get more effective funding for the transportation and road building changes we need, right?
I think that we're at a point in time where we've seen a lot of leadership at the local level, and we'd like to see an expansion of that leadership and that conversation into a bigger group of people. And I think, Brad, maybe you could talk a little bit more about what's happening in that conversation today.
There's a lot of things that are underway. There's conversations that are happening down at the Capitol right now. I'm hopeful that we're going to see something come out of the Capitol that may add some funding stream, some additional funding stream. There was some things that were passed last year, and we're very appreciative and thankful that those came through. But comparing it to our need that we are seeing of the unfunded projects that are going on, that just hasn't been large enough yet. So there's conversations at the Capitol, there's conversations occurring in the industry. There's a couple of different industry groups that are looking at new tax revenues to be able to add additional money into our transportation infrastructure accounts here. So we're going to be seeing a lot of that coming up in the coming months as we approach a November ballot measure. In Colorado, all these things will end up going to the ballot, and we as voters will get to decide what we want to do. But right now, I can think of 3 or 4 different initiatives that are out there, conversations happening. I think it's more conversations than I've seen happening in Colorado in a long time.
Really?
Yeah, and I think it's really good to be able to start to have a conversation about what's important, where do we want to put our resources, and have a broad conversation about what does our transportation world look like in the future. We have had a very probably not helpful knack of subdividing the transportation conversation into a lot of little pieces, and it makes it very hard to have a holistic view of where we're trying to go and what does it take to get there. I think for now, we're starting to have a more complete conversation, and that's really encouraging. I think it's also really encouraging when we hear from people who are not transportation engineers what they think is important and what matters to them most, so we make sure we're having the right conversation.
Great. So when we look overall, take an overview of why should we care about transportation, I appreciate you've touched on a lot. What do the rest of us, kind of as daily consumers, or those people who are out there on the roads, what did we contribute besides funding from the gas tax?
Well, I think Kara's going to get into a couple of things in the segment about
exactly.
what the public can contribute and what the public can really do to help these things. I think one of the biggest things is we need input. We need to know
Right.
what needs to be done. because and it's the little things, it's some of the little tweaks in that, to understand what is going on and what people's needs are as we think about how we want to build and enhance our transportation network, and how's it changing, because the usage of our transportation network is changing, and people adjust, and there's new technologies coming out that do different things. And
well, that's probably a big factor right now with the changes in technology, how our transportation system needs to adapt.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think in the coming years, you'll see what you see maintenance crews focusing their energy on shifting a little bit, because we are going to want to do those things that most support the new vehicles that will be coming into our system. I also think, and sorry guys, this is the safety person talking for a moment, but
Okay.
I think one of the things that the public can really do is wear your seatbelt and pay attention when you're driving, because the things that most disrupt our system are the times when we crash into each other. And those couple of things that we can choose to do that help us to manage our system have nothing to do with our taxes. They really just have to do with our personal behavior and our participation in using the system we have.
Well, that's a really great point, because I find myself now coming into Denver from further out on I-70, and at the beginning of the year it's still the beginning of the year, but there was the sign saying how many traffic deaths this year, and it's keeping up with how many days we've had in the year. And you said, but then you're contemplating as you're driving, what's my contribution to this, and when's it going to be my turn, or how does that factor out? So I know when we've talked with for example CDOT before, they're becoming more and more committed to lowering those incidents of traffic deaths, because it's outrageous at this point.
I think half of the passenger traffic deaths in 2016 were no seatbelt.
Really?
Yep. Half of them.
Right. Your car expects you to wear your seatbelt, number one, not your mother. I mean, your mother does, but that's not why you should wear it. And
well,
then
my car
two,
won't shut up, so I have to.
And then if you don't end up in your car can't protect you. So wearing your seatbelt really helps you to stay in your car when you get involved in a crash, and people who don't end up in the car frequently are at least very badly hurt. And
no kidding.
So
Yeah.
making those choices, those simple 3-second choices that we can all make a really big difference in what happens out on our highways and how much congestion we all experience.
Well, limiting our distractions.
Oh, that too.
Keeping focused on what your job is at this point in time, which is getting safely down the roadway and in an efficient manner. Just those little disruptions in the network, add to the problem.
It really does, and as diligent as we think we're being, I'll so much as put Waze up on my phone right there next to my steering wheel. I'm not looking far, but then you look up again and you're like, woo!
Right.
A lot of things happened while I was looking at Waze, wasn't it? Those distractions
Absolutely.
really do factor in.
Yep.
Bill, any thoughts?
I think the transportation system is something that's easy to take for granted. People don't think about it, and me included sometimes. It's you get your car, you drive to work, right?
Yeah.
One thing we need to be better at is to communicate that we need to put money into even just maintenance. Money into maintenance now is big money down the road. If we do nothing now, the dollars just go up exponentially if we don't take care of what we have. And it's been very difficult to do that with the funding that we've had.
Absolutely. It's an enormous task. I thank you all for dedicating your work to it. So we appreciate that. So I want to thank, again, Elizabeth Stolfus. She is a president of Stolfus and Associates. And Brad Doyle here is project director with Atkins and with Lavalin Group, or member of the NC Lavalin Group. So sorry, I rushed over that. And Bill Barreire, vice president and operations manager of Vivid Engineering Group. And we really thank you for this conversation, and we're going to come back after the break and talk more, and we'll focus then a little bit more on how a project works. So stick with us. We'll be right back. Thanks so much for staying with us today here on Connect and Collaborate. We're so happy to have this opportunity to talk with a number of engineers and different project managers with the American Council of Engineering Companies of Colorado. I guess you go by ACEC.
We do.
Yes.
ACEC Colorado.
I love it. So I want to kind of introduce everybody again. So returning this segment is Elizabeth Stolfus. She's president of Stolfus and Associates, and we're very glad to have you with us. I also have Kara Swanson, environmental planner with David Evan and Associates.
Hi,
Kara,
nice
thanks
to
for
be
being
here.
And Marilen Reimer, and she's the executive director of ACEC of Colorado.
Yes, thank you very much for having us.
Thank you all for being here. So I really enjoy the conversation we had last segment. And I'm thinking, so many of our listeners have to be in the car as this is live. So I think they appreciated the safety tips, right? And so let's move on a little bit. I know, Kara, you wanted to kind of provide some information of how a project works.
Yes.
Kind of, as I said in the last segment, we don't think about how all of this comes together.
Yep. And one question I hear a lot is, well, why does a project cost so much? I don't understand why transportation costs so much.
Yeah.
And I think before you can answer that, you really need to understand kind of everything that actually goes into a transportation project, which before I stumbled into the transportation world, I had no idea. All of the steps that, and the process that goes into it. And I think, it starts in planning, and it starts at looking, at a region-wide perspective. It can be rural areas, it can be urban areas, but what is that demand going to be, decades down the road? What is it that the region needs? And going from there, kind of identifying projects. So it's this entire planning phase, identifying those projects for funding. From there, you move into the environmental phase. And I think when people hear environmental, they immediately think of my least favorite phrase, which is bugs and bunnies, which, it's people think of the trees and the wildlife and everything else. Right.
But there's a lot more to consider.
There's a lot more that goes into it. The
Not
environmental.
That they aren't precious.
They are, and they are definitely part of it. But when I talk about environmental, it encompasses an awful lot more of that. It also includes identifying the need for a project. What is the problem that's out there? And what is your project going to try to do to solve that? And that really, you have to identify that. And that's based a lot in, Elizabeth can identify with the traffic data. A lot of that is traffic and safety operations information. So what is it that you're trying to solve? And that takes a while sometimes.
Sometimes finding that good match between the things that you might possibly do and the things that are realistic is extremely challenging.
Right. And so
Go ahead. Go ahead.
So once you've identified that need, kind of starting to identify what are those potential solutions for that? And that's where a lot of the traffic engineers, hydrology and hydraulics engineers, roadway engineers, it's collaborative. It's got everyone around the table looking at what are the different types of alternatives that could help solve that project. And that also goes back to, it all fits under environmental. And kind of working through that process, and woven through all of that is public involvement, which we can touch on a little bit more later. But once you have your alternatives, how do you screen those? What's important? What is it that you're looking at?
Because it'll be things like how a community is maybe impacted by the noise or by exhaust or
Absolutely.
all kinds of
Absolutely.
factors, also environmental.
Right. And maybe you have two alternatives, and maybe Elizabeth could touch on this a little bit more. If one of your goals is to improve safety on a corridor, the different types of things that you're going to evaluate and look at between those different alternatives.
Might have different footprints. They might have sort of different sizes, right? If you want to separate traffic movement so you stop having certain types of crashes, you may find that you need more space. And creating that more space may cause you to have to reconsider how valuable, in the context of all of the conversation, are those other things that become impacted by creating the more space to mitigate the crashing problem.
Mm-hmm. So kind of, you're weighing all of this as you're working through this process. And then you get to an alternative, and you're weighing impacts. Something may impact what's considered a historic property. It may impact wetlands. It may impact a community. And how are you evaluating all of those impacts? And then what are you going to do to quote unquote fix it, to mitigate those impacts? So this is it. It can be a long process. If you have a massive project, a major reconstruction project or something, it can take a while to work through those different alternatives, getting public input, weighing the options and your impacts of them. So it's not as simple, I think, as I probably thought it was when I first started out down this path.
Yes, I think that first obvious option turns out to always be more complicated than it seems when someone generates that first idea.
Right.
How about that? Well, and we were kind of discussing between the break here that, some of those considerations, when when I-70 was developed this last time, it split up some communities.
Absolutely. I think if you look at projects before they had to undergo any sort of environmental process, you look at what I-70 did to some of those neighborhoods. You look at what a lot of the interstate system did to a lot of the low-income and minority neighborhoods. And you look at, I kind of joked before about rivers catching on fire before you had environmental regulations in place. But there's a reason that these processes and these resources, 20-something of them that we look at, that we do look at those, and it's kind of to prevent us from going backwards and having those types of impacts that we've had before on communities and the environment as a whole.
So as we're looking to do the reconstruction for I-70 here, there's a lot of considerations, and there's public outreach to find out what they need, right?
Absolutely. And I think public outreach is something, it stretches throughout the entire life of a project through, first identifying what the project is all the way through construction. That's not really something that kind of ebbs and flows. Environmental resources will come in and out and traffic will come in and out, but public involvement is one of those things that is there throughout the entire process. And I think it's important to note, and I've heard people from the public say, "Oh, my input doesn't matter. You're going to do whatever you want,"
right.
Which, it's fair. I can see why they would have that perception. But even small things, we have a project recently where we were going to have a bike lane on the road, and we heard that's frightening. We don't actually want that there. So we were able to work with the engineers and actually widen the sidewalk and allow bikes there. So simple things that we wouldn't have thought about. As we can look at numbers, we can model, we can look at data and all of that, but until you actually get feedback on what the public thinks and hears and sees, it helps a lot on projects.
Right, because I'm sure you determined exactly how much space you would need for a bike lane and what a buffer would be, but still, I think any of us would be on a bike thinking, it's just one mistake away from, a disaster. But then when you want to make that kind of change, I bet there's then greater expense to make that bike lane separate from the roadway.
And not necessarily. And
no?
I think that's and Elizabeth can probably touch on that a little bit better from the engineering side. Just because it's a change doesn't mean that it's always going to be more expense.
Okay. I think one of the things that's really interesting about engineers in general is that we're very much trained to optimize, right?
Right.
We take a lot of different competing interests and look for something that best meets a lot of different ideas. And sometimes when we're doing that, we might have a preconceived notion about what each value has among those things. And when we don't hear enough input from the community, we might misvalue what's most important. When we're able to get a good, solid read on the individuals and businesses and population that's affected by a project, we can make a very strong assessment and deliver a really solid project that does all of those things and manages cost, because cost is one of the components, but it's certainly not the only component.
Okay, good to know. And then we can talk about the timeline of the projects. I'm sure a lot of people ask, why do they take so long? And that's part of kind of, I think, what turns people off when they're thinking, if they're going to do all this construction, then how long it's going to be hung up, and is it going to interfere with I-25? And blah, blah, blah. So what perspective can you share there, Kara?
I think a lot of it, at least, and I kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, there's a lot of data. There's a lot of data and analysis that goes into identifying the need for the project, identifying alternatives, identifying the environmental resources, impacts, mitigation, all of that. But then you also have agency review throughout the environmental process. And that's not just, on a local agency project or CDOT. It's not just that main agency, it's also resource agency. So you have Fish and Wildlife Service or the State Historic Preservation Office, and I could sit here and name dozens of them. But it's each of them have a specialty, and there's a reason that they're reviewing that project, because they don't want to miss anything and you don't want to miss anything. So a lot of that is review time. And one thing I didn't touch on before, I got through the kind of planning and environmental part, but I didn't even touch on design. Once you get through environmental, you do a little bit of engineering, because you have to identify your alternative. But that doesn't even start to touch on moving into preliminary engineering and final design, utilities, right of way. And maybe I can kind of toss it to Elizabeth to talk a little bit more about that and schedule.
And we also, we look at things like, how would you construct a project? How would you put the parts together so that at the end of the day you end up with the complete project? And that might really drive a lot of new questions, because it might be about, if I construct it in one sequence, it makes some of my resources too hard to get to. If I construct it in a different sequence, it disrupts traffic a whole lot. So sometimes those conversations create a need for more investigation of what are the possibilities for delivering this project in the most effective and efficient way. And sometimes that conversation gets to be about convenience, and sometimes it ends up being about cost.
Great. That's really interesting, because you're just revealing all this stuff that I've never thought of before. And as you say it, I'm like, well, of course you're considering all of these things, but it's fascinating to see really how much does go into engineering these plans and making it all ready to either go under construction or whatever we need.
And I think I look at the engineers in my office, and I am not remotely an engineer. I don't pretend to be one.
Kara Swanson is an environmental planner.
Right. Let's be clear on that. So I'm not speaking for engineers, but the amount of detail and iterations, and I mean, being an engineer, you have to be a detail person.
Absolutely.
And so, we even simple questions like, well, where's the water going to go on your project? If you're adding a lane of traffic, or what are you doing during construction? Utilities. I never think about utilities under the ground.
Sure.
And conflicts. Are you going to have to move them? Are you going to have to install new ones? And there's all of these pieces, and they're all different expertise that falls under engineering. That all play into that overall, getting to your final design and actually having a set of engineering plans that people can build from.
Can you give us examples? What are some of the best practices of some of these transportation projects that we could look to and say, like, can we? Like, gee, this one was really done well, or...
I think some of the best practices, or at least in my experience, are those times where over the lifetime of a project, you've gone out and inquired of the population you're working with what's important to you, and they've told you, and you've been able to demonstrate how the solutions that you've found to match their problems also fit with what's important to them besides just the core problem. So a lot of times the core problem is about congestion, or it might be about crashing, or it might be about the confusing organization of the way some roads come together. But when you get to the heart of the matter, people really care about, can I get where I need to go when I want to be there? And when we can deliver that, and when we can deliver a system that they can understand and a construction process that they don't feel surprised by, I think that is really a good measure of success and a good best practice. I think when someone comes to you at the end of the project and they were very frustrated at the beginning of the project and they've changed their point of view, I think that's when we've done our job really well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I was kind of tagging on to that, all of that information that Elizabeth just talked about, understanding the public that you are trying to reach and how to reach them. Because not all populations are the same.
Oh, that's a whole other feat that is outside of what engineers do, I'd imagine.
Yep. And understanding that, not everyone is on social media. Not everyone checks email.
Right.
Maybe some people want hard copy mailers. Maybe some people want a phone call. And really having a robust enough public involvement process that you truly understand the public. And in terms of how they want to be reached, maybe you have non-English speaking populations, but all of those things that you need to think about. If you truly want, good feedback and to be able to communicate and have quote unquote happy public at the end, those are all things that, I think we've learned over the years that you really need to take into account.
And to really have the ability to be courageous when you're finding that you're not connecting, to try other strategies, because we have a lot of tried and true strategies that, I think I said earlier, the world is changing fast, right? Yeah. People are responding differently. Some of the tactics we've used for many, many, many years are becoming decliningly successful. So how can we re-engage those folks that no longer have time to stop by on their way home?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's interesting.
I think another part of the best practices is also back to the collaboration that was mentioned in the beginning. And we talked about the teams, but it's also about the agencies that they all work with. So, for instance, part of this is to determine what's the best delivery method, what's the best way to put the team together. Should it be a design-build project? That means of bringing everybody together is totally different, but the idea is to put the best team together to deliver the project in the best efficient manner.
Marilen has another good point here. We've changed who our project team is a lot over the last few years. I have to say that I have more firefighters and police officers and emergency responders in my project teams than I ever had before. Sometimes we have librarians, and we have the person that runs the transportation part of the school district participating in the day-to-day meetings of the project, and that's something that 20 years ago would never have happened.
Oh, that's really interesting. Because you mentioned like the librarian, and my thoughts go to that's somebody who knows, how kids are getting to the library or back home, or they are going to know some of those more personal aspects that really matter, right?
Absolutely. And they're going to have a pulse on what's interesting to their community because they know the kinds of events that they host at the library. So they know what are people talking about? Are they talking about trails, or are they talking about turn lanes? What is that conversation that's happening every day that happens at the coffee shop, but may or may not be happening in my office?
Well, and then I want to dive into another example you gave with the firefighters and police, because they know then, what kind of accidents happened, how awful they were.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. And it's interesting because when I look at my database, I only see the people that crash. If
Right.
they don't actually crash, they're invisible to me. When they look in their database, they see every contact they get involved with. So we've expanded our ability to have a conversation about what's important.
So they can give you information on the person who avoided the accident.
That's right. We can talk about
wow.
conversations that involve near misses that we otherwise wouldn't be able to see at all because we weren't looking for them. I've been looking for crashes. But guess what? Near misses are a pretty big deal too.
Yeah, they are.
And I was going to say the other thing is not only the crash information, but also their response to it. So can they get there?
Right.
Is there a wide enough shoulder? Are there redundant lanes of traffic? Can they go around the existing traffic that's there? And I think that is a big part of it. Is there a median there? Can they not get around? Make a U-turn?
Definitely, because we've been in the transportation profession. We've been reducing shoulders and medians constantly for the last several years because we've been looking to put more driving lanes. But guess what we've also been doing? Cutting off access for emergency responders. So how do we be more thoughtful about that and bring those parts together when we've been looking at two different pictures? It's really, I found, at least for me, I'm trained to look at the system and they're trained to look right at the source of the problem. If I can look there and they can look at the system, we can get much better results overall.
Wonderful. Well, and I'm just thinking it's heartbreaking when you're in that situation that you're sitting in traffic and you can't move and you're seeing the lights and sirens behind you and thinking, this help is delayed. And they're, and what can you do? And wow, you guys are in charge of that. Thank you for that. Trying to fix it, not you. Kara.
Let's be clear, the environmental person not in charge of that.
Yes, you gather plenty of information that helps.
I do.
Oh, that's funny. So Marilen, I would like you to touch on the ACEC for a bit. What exactly you do to bring all of these engineers and these firms together to help really solve the problems we need solved out there on the road?
Well, ACEC is a business organization for consulting engineering firms. So they are all technically trained, but as they move on into their career to the business side, because you're dealing with people that are business owners, they need to have some business expertise to make sure that they're successful businesses. So we're part of that. I like seeing your tagline for the Colorado Business Roundtable, connect and collaborate, because that's what we do.
Right.
So we're bringing people together. We work with, they have the technical expertise and the business acumen to be great resources for agencies, for decision makers like legislators, for the public, to help them understand what that project's going to be about. We also provide educational trainings and networking opportunities, not just for our members, but also those in the design and construction industry. And we like to feed the pipeline. We have a need for more engineers and planners and all the support staff of our member firms. And so we have quite an extensive leadership development program, and we also provide $40,000 in scholarship money to engineering students in Colorado engineering schools every year. And we also watch legislation, obviously.
Oh, yeah.
So as Brad mentioned about the transportation funding, there is a lot of groups collaborating in order to figure out what be the best way to fund our transportation moving forward. I'm very encouraged by the legislature. Transportation funding is still a top priority. It may not seem like it, but there's a lot of things going on in conversations to come up with the best means to fund transportation.
Well, and I know you're very active. I know there was just you've got a symposium coming up. I know you had something in February, and you've got more coming up.
We have our transportation training that's in partnership with CDOT. It is our annual training for Colorado transportation environmental professionals. It starts tomorrow morning, March 6th, and extends until about 2 o'clock, Wednesday, March 7th, at the Sheridan Denver Downtown Hotel. Information's on our website, acec-co.org. And what's exciting this year is we're closing our discussion our event with a discussion on transportation funding. We have the acting administrator from FHWA, Brandy Hendrickson. We have the Speaker of the House, Crisanta Duran, and the Senate Transportation Committee Chair, John Cook. We have the Governor's Legislative Director, Kurt Morrison, and we have Tony Milo, who's the Executive Director for Colorado Contractors Association, but he's representing the Coloradoans for Colorado Transportation Coalition. They've put those ballot measures, it's going through the process to be on the ballot. So it's going to be a quite interesting discussion to see what might come out of legislation or the ballot to provide more reliable transportation funding. That's the key. We need reliable funding for all of them to plan these major projects.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Marilen. And I'm going to ask Carolyn and Elizabeth I'm sorry, Kara.
It's fine. It's combined. It's good. It's fine.
Kara and Marilen, look at me. I told you I'd do something. So what do you get as business professionals here in engineering and in the transportation, I guess, industry, for lack of a better word? What do you get from ACEC, and what does that? How does it benefit?
I can talk from an environmental perspective. So I'm the environmental committee chair, and the group of people that we have on the environmental committee, it's awesome. I mean, we help plan what we have coffees with. We call them coffees with CDOT every month, and it's a different environmental topic. And so this committee is able to work with CDOT and kind of help plan those topics. But it provides a network. For me, and I know the other folks, that we can then pick up the phone or shoot an email. I'm having an issue with this resource. I'm having a problem on this project, and there is you don't become competitive at that point. It's people helping other consultants, because you ultimately want to deliver a good project and you want to do a good job. And so I think that's been a huge benefit to me personally with being involved in that.
And I wholeheartedly agree with that perspective. And as a business owner, I think one of the other things it provides, which is very similar, is there are a lot of business owners that have already done all of the things that I might ever do over the rest of my career. And as I come up upon those, there's always someone I can call. And if I don't know who to call, I call Marilen, and Marilen says, call these 3 people.
Yes.
And, it doesn't matter if I wanted to buy a building or I had a problem employee, there would be somebody who already knows how to work through that issue and help me find a good path forward.
Wow, that's an incredible resource.
Yes, and that's where we're available. And like Elizabeth says, there's so many people who have been there, done that, and we're happy to make that connection for people. We're happy to collaborate with the agencies that we work with to have a better process in place, to make sure that we can do things more efficiently and productive. And so it's been a great organization, and one that we're hoping to continue to be that resource to people.
I'm really impressed by the spirit of collaboration that I'm hearing. Like we said before, with all of the engineering firms, with everybody that's working together. You said it's not competitive. It's really
occasionally it's competitive. But
it wasn't competitive. It wouldn't even be worth doing a little bit. But yeah, you get a lot of great feedback and some great information passed along, don't you?
We have a very strong consulting engineering community.
Wonderful.
And so there's a lot of resources from the different firms that are here in Colorado.
Wait, so we say that here in Colorado. Do you think the environment is the same in other states? Would you know?
Yes, there is. There's a lot ACECs in every one of the states.
That's right.
And so
I like to think Colorado's a little special.
I kind of think that
in a good way.
Thanks so much. I want to especially thank Marilen Reimer, Executive Director of ACEC of Colorado, Elizabeth Stolfus with Stolfus and Associates, thank you so much, and Kara Swanson, Environmental Planner David Evans and Associates, and I made sure to get everybody's name right at the end.
Yes,
Thank you.
Thank you so much.